Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're tackling a brand new executive order straight from the White House, and this one's zeroing in on K-12 education.
And it's causing quite a stir.
Yeah, no kidding. A lot of folks might be thinking executive order sounds kind of bureaucratic, right? Like, is this a big deal?
Well, it's definitely more than just like a memo from the boss, you know? I mean, an executive order comes straight from the president, and it has the force of law.
Whoa. Okay, so this is some serious business then.
No doubt about it.
So we're not just talking about ideas floating around here.
Yeah.
This is the president putting their foot down.
And you know what else is interesting?
What's that?
This order goes right to the heart of some really hot-button issues. We're talking about, like, parental rights in education, the content of what's actually being taught in schools, and even things like gender ideology and white privilege.
Oh, yeah, this thing is wading right into the culture wars.
Definitely. And the thing is, it doesn't just state a problem. It lays out a whole plan for dealing with it.
So it's like a roadmap for change in education.
Yeah.
Exactly.
By the end of this deep dive, you'll know exactly what this executive order is trying to do, and we'll explore how it might shake things up in schools all over the country.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. So the order kicks off by basically saying, hey, there's a problem in K-12 education. What they call radical anti-American ideologies are spreading, and parents aren't being given enough say in what their kids are learning.
Right, and to really understand what they're getting at, we need to look at the context here. In recent years, there's been this wave of anxiety, particularly from some parent groups, about the influence of certain ideologies in schools.
So they feel like schools are pushing certain beliefs onto their kids.
Yeah, kind of like schools are overstepping their bounds.
Yeah, and the order really echoes that fear, right? I mean, it uses strong language, even saying that these practices are eroding critical thinking and sowing division.
They definitely aren't mincing words.
Nope. They even go so far as to name specific examples of what they consider indoctrination, like teaching things like white privilege or encouraging kids to think about their gender identity.
Now that's where things get really interesting, because these are topics that are sparking huge debates all over the country.
For sure. And to understand how the order wants to fix all this, we need to break down some of the key terms they define, like discriminatory equity ideology, patriotic education, even social transition.
Yeah, these are loaded terms, each with a very specific meaning in the context of this order.
Let's start with discriminatory equity ideology, because I think a lot of folks might scratch their heads at that one.
Right, it's not exactly something you hear in everyday conversation.
So what are they actually talking about?
Well, the order defines it as any ideology that divides people into, like, preferred and disfavored groups based on their identity.
So it's about categorizing people rather than judging them on their individual merits.
Precisely. And the order argues that this way of thinking actually promotes discrimination instead of fighting it.
They're saying it's counterproductive.
Yeah, they emphasize individual merit and say that focusing on group identity is ultimately harmful.
And they even give specific examples, right?
Oh yeah, things like white privilege and unconscious bias are specifically mentioned as falling under this discriminatory equity ideology.
So they're implying that teaching these ideas is actually driving us apart as a country.
That's the gist of it. And here's where it gets a bit tricky. By labeling these concepts as discriminatory, they're opening the door to maybe restricting them or even banning them from being taught in schools altogether.
That's a pretty big deal. So that's discriminatory equity ideology. What about patriotic education? How do they define that?
Well, this is where the order takes a really interesting turn. They define patriotic education as teaching American history, but with a big emphasis on the country's founding principles and the idea that America has, over time, grown closer to its noble principles.
So it's about highlighting the positive aspects of American history, focusing on the nation's achievements.
Exactly. It's a very different approach from what some critics argue is happening in schools now, where there's more focus on the nation's shortcomings, its past injustices, and systemic inequalities.
It's almost like they're trying to reframe the narrative of American history.
Yeah, kind of like painting a more heroic picture.
Interesting. Okay, so we've got discriminatory equity ideology and patriotic education. Now, there's one more term that's particularly sensitive, and that's social transition. How do they define that?
This was defined as the steps a student might take to align their outward appearance with a gender identity that's different from the sex they were assigned at birth.
This is where I can see parents getting really fired up.
Absolutely, because we're talking about things like using a student's preferred name and pronouns, letting them use bathrooms that match their gender identity even participating in sports according to their gender identity.
And the order is very clear about their concerns about social transition happening in schools without parents knowing or giving their consent.
Right. They're drawing a direct line to parental rights here.
They even suggest that these practices could be violating federal laws designed to protect those rights.
Laws like FERPA and the PPRA, which we'll unpack a bit later.
Yeah.
But the key takeaway here is they're setting the stage for potential legal battles.
It sounds like they're drawing a line in the sand. Okay, so we've got the problem as this order sees it, and we've deciphered some of their key terms. But what are they actually proposing to do about it? What concrete actions are they taking?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting because they've laid out what they're calling the ending indoctrination strategy. And it's a multi-pronged approach.
And one of the big moves is bringing back the 1776 commission right. That was created under a previous administration, but was quickly dismantled.
Exactly. This commission was all about promoting patriotic education. And bringing it back is a clear signal that they want to counter what they see as a distorted and overly negative portrayal of American history.
So they want to change the way history is being taught.
You got?
Okay, so we've got the ending indoctrination strategy and the return of the 1776 commission. What else is in this action plan?
Well, they're also targeting how federal funding is used in K-12 education. They're basically telling government agencies to investigate whether federal money is supporting anything related to gender ideology or discriminatory equity ideology.
Wow, so if schools want to keep getting federal funding, they need to fall in line with this order.
That's the message. And that raises some big questions about the power dynamic between the federal government and local school districts, something we should definitely dig into more.
Absolutely. And then there's this whole emphasis on parental rights. This order hammers that point home again and again. It's all about parents being involved in their kids' education and having the right to know what's going on in the classroom.
Yeah, this is a cornerstone of the whole order. They claim that parents have been intentionally shut out of decision-making in schools. They even suggest that some common practices are actually breaking federal laws meant to protect those parental rights.
And to make sure those rights are enforced, they're calling on the Attorney General and state attorneys general to crack down on any teachers or school officials who they think are violating the law.
This could lead to a flood of lawsuits against schools and teachers.
Yeah, it seems like things could get pretty messy. So as we're processing all of this, I want to pause and ask you, our listener, what are your first impressions? What stands out to you about this order and the issues it's raising?
And keep in mind, we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack here. So, we were talking about how this executive order could actually play out in schools, right?
Yeah, like how this thing's going to land in real life classrooms?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest impacts could be on how schools are funded.
Right, because they're definitely making it clear that they're looking to use federal dollars to kind of nudge schools in a certain direction. It's like they're saying, hey, if you want our money, you got to play by our rules.
That's the gist of it. And to understand how that would work, we need to remember how K-12 education is actually funded in the U.S. You see, most of the money comes from state and local taxes. Federal funding is just a piece of the pie.
But it's going to be a pretty big piece, right?
Oh yeah, it's significant. And while the feds don't usually tell schools what to teach or how to run things, they can attach strings to that funding. So schools that rely on those federal dollars might feel some pressure to adopt certain policies or practices to keep that money coming in.
So it's a way to influence things without, like, directly controlling them.
Exactly. And this executive order seems to be setting up that kind of dynamic. They're instructing agencies to figure out exactly how federal money is being used to support anything they label as gender ideology or discriminatory equity ideology.
It's like they're shining a spotlight on the specific areas.
Right, and the implications are pretty huge.
Yeah.
Schools might be forced to make a tough choice, either change what they're doing to align with the order or risk losing that crucial federal funding.
Talk about a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, and you got to think about what that would mean for schools that are already struggling financially. Would they feel like they have any choice but to comply, even if they disagree with the order?
I mean, it's hard to say no when you're desperate for resources.
For sure. And that brings up questions about fairness and equal access to education for all students.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper into those parental rights that we touched on earlier. The order specifically mentions FERPA and the PPRA.
Yeah, those acronyms can be a mouthful.
Totally. So for folks who aren't familiar with the legal lingo, can you break those down in plain English? Like, what do they mean for parents and students in the real world?
Okay, so FERPA stands for the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It basically gives parents certain rights when it comes to their kids' school records. Like parents have the right to see those records and request corrections if they think something's wrong.
So it's about transparency and making sure parents are in the loop.
Exactly. And then there's the PPRA, which is the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment.
Yeah.
This one goes a step further and gives parents the right to know about and even opt their kids out of certain surveys, evaluations, or activities that they might find iffy.
Like if they think it's too sensitive or personal?
Right.
Right.
Exactly. So FERPA is about access to records, and PPRA is about having a say in what their kid participates in at school.
Got it. But how does this executive order fit into all of this?
Well, the order claims that FERPA and the PPRA are being violated in certain cases, especially when it comes to things like gender identity and social transition. They're saying that schools are sometimes leaving parents in the dark about their kids' gender exploration or expression.
So it's like a transparency issue.
Yeah, they're saying parents aren't being given enough information or control.
And they're not just talking about it. They're actually directing the Attorney General to work with state attorneys general to enforce these parental rights.
Which could mean a whole wave of lawsuits against schools and educators.
Yeah, this is where things could get really messy. You know, teachers might start hesitating to even talk about these sensitive topics out of fear of getting sued.
It could create this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty in schools.
It's like this order is trying to balance parental rights with making sure students feel safe and supported at school.
Yeah, it's a tough balance, and this order seems to be tilting the scales pretty heavily in favor of parental control.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about the 1776 Commission. You know, the one they're bringing back?
The one that was created and then quickly dismantled.
That's the one. So if I'm remembering right, this was originally formed by a previous administration, but it didn't last long.
It was pretty short-lived.
Yeah.
The 1776 Commission was all about promoting patriotic education, but it got a ton of pushback right from the start.
Why was that?
Well, critics argued that it was basically trying to whitewash American history and sweep the nation's problems under the rug.
So it was seen as a way to present a sanitized version of history.
Yeah, kind of. Like they were trying to downplay the bad stuff and just focus on the good.
So bringing it back is probably going to stir up just as much controversy, if not more.
Oh, absolutely. This order clearly sees the 1776 Commission as a major part of their strategy to change how American history is taught. They're giving the commission the job of creating a presidential 1776 award for students organizing patriotic lectures and even advising other government agencies on how to promote patriotic education at places like national parks and monuments.
Wow, they're really going all in on this.
No doubt about it. And it's interesting that they're tying this so closely to the 250th anniversary of American independence, which is coming up soon.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to use this big milestone to push a certain narrative about what it means to be American.
You hit the nail on the head. It's all part of a bigger effort to promote a very specific vision of American history and national identity. And the timing coinciding with this big anniversary is definitely not a coincidence.
Okay, so we've talked about funding parental rights and even the history curriculum, but what about the legal side of all of this? Is this thing going to hold up in court?
Well, that's where things could get really complicated because this executive order is based on the idea that certain things happening in schools are already breaking federal laws. But those laws are open to interpretation, and there are bound to be legal challenges to how this order is actually put into practice.
So we could see lawsuits from both sides.
Exactly. Parents who feel like their rights are being violated, and schools and teachers who feel like the order is overstepping its bounds.
And those legal battles could drag on forever, creating even more uncertainty and disruption.
It's definitely a possibility. And it's also important to remember that executive orders can be reversed by future presidents. So the long-term impact of this order is still up in the air.
It's like we're watching this whole thing unfold in slow motion.
Yeah.
We can see the initial impact, but we have no idea how far the ripples will spread or what the final outcome will be.
That's a good way to put it. The potential for disruption is huge, but the end game is still a mystery.
And as we're trying to wrap our heads around all of this, I think it's important to remember that education isn't just about filling kids' heads with facts. It's about shaping young minds, helping them develop critical thinking skills, and preparing them to be informed, engaged citizens.
And that's the heart of the matter, isn't it? What kind of education will best equip students for the challenges of the 21st century? What role should schools play in shaping their values and beliefs? These are huge questions that go way beyond this one executive order.
They're fundamental questions about the purpose of education itself.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we want to leave you, our listener, with something to chew on. What are your thoughts on the role of federal funding in education? Do you think parents have enough say in what their kids are learning, and what does patriotic education really mean to you?
These are tough questions with no easy answers. But they're questions we need to be talking about if we want to build an education system that truly works for all students.
So, as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into this executive order,
Yep.
I think it's important to step back and look at the big picture here.
I agree. It's really easy to get caught up in the details, but this order, it didn't come out of nowhere. It's part of a much larger conversation that's been happening for a while now.
Yeah, there's this real sense of division in the country right now, especially when it comes to things like race and gender and how we teach our history.
It's like there are these two very different ways of looking at the world, and schools have become this battleground for those competing viewpoints.
Yeah, it feels like everyone's picking sides and it's getting harder and harder to find common ground.
And I think it's really important to acknowledge that there are legitimate concerns on both sides of this debate. Some parents are genuinely worried that the values they're trying to teach their kids at home are being contradicted or even undermined by what's being taught in schools.
Right, and then on the other side, you have people who are concerned that this executive order is going to stifle critical thinking and limit students' exposure to a wider range of perspectives.
Exactly. It's like a tug of war between parental rights and the right of students to receive a well-rounded education.
And the question is, how do we find that balance? How do we respect both sides without swinging too far in one direction or the other?
It's a tough question. And honestly, this executive order seems to be coming down pretty hard on one side of that debate, prioritizing a particular interpretation of American history and national identity.
One thing that really stood out to me was this emphasis on celebrating American history. The order talks about patriotic education and focusing on the nation's triumphs, its progress towards achieving its ideals. I just wonder, what does that actually look like in the classroom?
It's a good question because it gets to the heart of what history is all about. Is it primarily about glorifying the past, or is it about examining our mistakes, acknowledging the darker chapters, and learning from them?
I mean, ideally, it would be both right, but how do you do that in a way that's both honest and inspiring?
That's the million-dollar question. And I'm not sure this executive order provides a satisfying answer. It seems to be suggesting that there's only one right way to teach American history, a way that emphasizes a very specific narrative.
And that worries me because it could discourage teachers from exploring controversial topics or presenting different
Oh,
viewpoints.
absolutely. It could create a climate of fear in schools where teachers are afraid to step outside the lines for fear of getting in trouble.
It's like they're being handed a script and told to stick to it.
Exactly. Which doesn't leave much room for critical thinking or open discussion.
And then there's the question of how all of this is going to affect students. Will it actually make them more patriotic? Or will it alienate those who don't see their own experiences or identities reflected in this particular version of American history?
Those are questions we can't answer for sure right now, but they are definitely worth thinking about. And I have a feeling that the rollout of this order is going to be pretty messy and controversial, with lots of pushback and legal challenges along the way.
It sounds like we're in for a bumpy ride.
Buckle up. It's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's safe to say that this executive order has opened up a whole can of worms. There are going to be unintended consequences, disagreements, legal battles. It's going to be a long road.
And one thing to keep in mind is that education is always evolving.
Yeah.
What we teach and how we teach it is always subject to debate and revision. This executive order is just one moment in that ongoing evolution.
It's an attempt to steer education in a particular direction. But at the end of the day, it's up to educators, parents, and communities to decide what kind of education system we want for our kids.
And that's a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play. We can't just sit back and watch this unfold. We need to stay informed, engage in these conversations, and advocate for the kind of education we believe in.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you, our listener, with one final thought to ponder. This executive order calls for patriotic education. But what does that actually mean to you? How can we balance critical thinking with a sense of national pride in our schools?
It's a tough question, but it's a question worth wrestling with, because the future of our country depends on how we educate the next generation. And that's a responsibility we all share.
So stay curious, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.